Hey, good morning. My name is Mario Lunato. I'm a principal cloud infrastructure architect here at Aquia. And then this is Kaus. We're going to talk to you, we'll do a deeper introduction here in a second, but we're going to talk to you about harnessing GRC tools and trying to use that pre-ATO, to automate some of your compliance needs, tracking your POAMs, all of that good stuff to really help relieve that burden of doing all that stuff manually. So to do a quick introduction of myself, as I said, principal cloud infrastructure architect here at Aquia. I've been in cyber for about 9 years now. Anything from help desk all the way up to now a lot more cloud security and things like that. Previous DoD, Air Force expertise there, so a lot of stuff around FedRAMP, RMF, things like that in that space. Yeah, pass it over to Kaus.
Thank you. I'm founder at Caveonix, also the inventor of the product that we have built around the space for automation, for GRC automation. Been in this space for 20 plus years, work with a number of agencies, both on DoD side, civilian side, and the whole ecosystem. So large SIs who have to deliver their products and services with FISMA compliance, FedRAMP compliance to the customers. And that's essentially is how we got to build the product and build technology and started working with Aquia because they're helping some of these accounts and customers in meeting their FISMA FedRAMP requirements. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the automation component.
Awesome. So kind of kick it off, a little bit of a joke into it of, managing all these things in Excel, Word docs, all that stuff, it can be very cumbersome. To kind of put in perspective, like FedRAMP High, it's 421 controls now with revision 5. So not only do you have to manage all of those 420 controls in Excel sheets, you have to also, manage the POAMs, tracking the tasks to make sure they're getting done. Any compliance procedure documentation, anything like that is all now being stored in Google Docs or Jira or wherever you have it. You may be using all of those tools and have everything sparsed out. And it's hard to keep version control, what's the latest doc for stakeholders or, for higher ups to take a look at. Is there a live doc that everybody's collaborating on? Maybe there's a new doc that somebody doesn't know about and you're editing an old doc. Things like that, that can really become a pain point. And there's a lot of things that you have to manage within that documentation. So it can be really hard and cumbersome on folks to do. So to kind of point into there, talk more about it and categorize it a little bit. So content and documentation management, as I mentioned, you have Excel sheets, Word, you have the POAM tasks, actual working tasks, people who are closing these gaps that you have found during like your gap assessment. All those things need to be managed. You can have problems doing that, keeping them all up to date, and make sure everybody's on track to do what they're doing and presenting that in a way to leadership with up-to-date documentation. Risk analytics and reporting. Sometimes you have a bunch of tools that are doing all this for you. They're managing your vulnerabilities. They're managing how you're staying on top of compliance needs. Like there's some AWS services like config and stuff like that. Maybe you're using multiple services, but there's no one place that all of this data is being sent. So it's hard to really get a good big picture of like what's really happening in terms of risk and doing the reporting. Compliance management, kind of mentioned like AWS config, having something that's making sure the compliance things you're setting in place, things from FedRAMP controls, or even if it's not FedRAMP, other frameworks that you're monitoring, making sure that the things you're putting in place are staying on top of what it's supposed to, that the compliance is actually being met. You didn't put something in place and it's not doing what you want it to be doing. So making sure that you're staying on top of that. Centralized dashboards. I mentioned giving information to stakeholders. Sometimes they don't want to, go down in the weeds and get this long document of things they have to read. They just want to see like a pretty dashboard, like a pie chart or something of seeing what's happening in real time, kind of where the company, the business sits against these controls, against the compliance framework. Just a quick brief that they can get in a meeting or something along those lines. They don't want to sit there and read through all the Excel sheets and all of that, hard documentation that's going on there. And then security. So not only in terms of overall security of meeting the framework and compliance and all of that, but also securing these documentations that you're using. Like maybe you're using Jira tasks to track stuff that holds metadata of your information or of the information systems. Vulnerability findings, things like that. Who's working on them? So making sure you're controlling access to those things as well. So that way the wrong information isn't ending up to people who shouldn't be knowing about it. Getting leaked or anything like that. So not only the broader security, but also the security around controlling access to that information. And then so to actually get into like the FedRAMP ATO stuff, you have plans of actions and milestones, POAMs. it can be difficult. Like I was saying, there's 421 controls just in FedRAMP high. Moderate is, I think there are like 325, lows like 120 or somewhere around there. But it can be cumbersome because not only have you done the gap assessment, maybe we're out of compliance for 320 of the 425 controls. Now you have to go track that as a POAM, and you have to stay on top of actually doing that work. And it can be hard to keep all that up to date, and wherever you're tracking in your ticket system or Excel sheets and all of that good stuff. SSP, so your system security plan, writing the SSP and saying like, hey, this is the control, this is how we're actually doing it. And then maybe you don't have a way to track, are we actually doing that? Are we just saying we're doing this, but there's no way to really see it? Or maybe the data that's showing we are doing it is just spread out all over the place, and now we have to get into this one document, into one area, one kind of form. So it can be difficult to do that. Security assessment reports. So the report that's going on about the ATO process. So how are you conducting the assessment? What the findings are? Like what gaps there are, what controls that we're not meeting. What like security vulnerability findings, from your scanning tools, your scanning reports, all that kind of good stuff. Security assessment plan. So how is the assessment being done? What are we looking at? What are we collecting to see that, hey, this compliance is being done? We're meeting these things and getting to where we need to be in a timely manner. And then evidence collection. Not only is it hard to do it and keep it stored in a lot of places, you Google Drive or whatever it may be that you're using to do this. A lot of GRC tools can also do a lot of the evidence collection for you. So it can find the compliance needs that you're trying to do instead of having to go grab snapshots of like your cloud infrastructure or where you're keeping things and making sure like, hey, this is what we're doing to actually do the things we're saying we're do. So it can be very cumbersome, and that's a lot of what comes down to the timely matter. Towards the end of the ATO, you're scrambling to find, hey, we don't have evidence collection for said control. We're trying to push through the end to get this package up. So it can be a big struggle to keep your evidence collected and making sure you're getting the right evidence you actually need. So then I talked a little bit about it, but these are kind of addressing those problems that I mentioned in the earlier slides with GRC tools, how they actually help. So for like content document management, a lot of GRC tools or platforms you can store your policy procedure, you can store the SSP, the POAMs, all that good stuff in one centralized place. So you not only, like at the bottom there, to skip ahead a little bit, security, you have one place to make sure people have access to, one set of like accounts to manage, roles to manage for folks to have access to all of these things. So it's not all over the place, and it makes it cumbersome to really manage what's going on. The risk analytics and reporting. A lot of tools will do to kind of jump in with the compliance management piece too. For instance, to throw out an AWS service like AWS Config, you can deploy conformance packs that are the set controls from like NIST 853, HIPAA, or whatever the control framework that you're working with. In this case, for FedRAMP, NIST 853. It'll check your compliance in your cloud environment or wherever you're being hosted, whether it's on-prem or maybe in Azure or a different one. I just throw out AWS Config as a specific tooling, but it'll tell you like, hey, are you actually meeting these compliance controls and all these frameworks? Are you actually like disabling your root accounts? Changing passwords when you need to, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of GRC tools and platforms will automate that, and they'll tell you right in your dashboards, right in the tool itself, like, hey, you're not doing this, you need to do this, and it'll give you a blurb of like how to implement it, how to get to where you need to be, and how to document it, and all that good stuff. And then centralized dashboards, for those stakeholders and those people that are higher up that, they don't have a lot of time for the rundown of what's really happening to get into the weeds. You can give them access to a tool, maybe take some screenshots of the tool itself, the platform or the GRC tool, to give them those nice, pretty dashboards to say like, hey, like this is how compliant we are. These are the controls we have left, percentages, stuff like that, to really give them an insight to what's happening, but not to really bog them down with getting into the weeds and giving them all this heavy documentation and all that stuff, to just give them a quick, hey, down and dirty, this is kind of what's happening. So then to jump over to the more specific with like FedRAMP and the things going on with the ATO, POAMs, a lot of GRC tools and platforms will do this for you in the sense that, hey, we see you're not meeting compliance here. It'll flag it and say there's a task that needs to be had here, and you can create a POAM action out of it and then report that and actually pull that POAM that it generates for you right out of it and give it into your assessment and create your documents that are around POAMs and procedures, or POAMs and like completing risk tasks. right out of there, and it'll do it for you. You don't have to do the manual creation of it. It'll tell you like, hey, this is the control, this system is working it, this is when it's going to be done, all that good stuff. So it's pretty automated in that sense. SSPs, you can pull templates in because FedRAMP, for instance, they have their specific template and everything that you want it to, that they want you to deliver the package in. You can pull templates right into a lot of tools nowadays, and it'll start generating these things based on, again, like, doing the compliance checks to your system. It will start to generate this SSP for you and say, like, as you're entering your control statements for specific controls, it'll start gathering all of that data and writing up your SSP. So, maybe in your Excel sheet, to put it in like the manual perspective, like AC1, where we're doing this, you put it in like the control spreadsheet, and then now you have to go rewrite that in SSP or come back and copy and paste it and put it into your SSP. A GRC tool will do that for you. You write the control statement once, and then it's already pulling that information to help generate your SSP. You don't have to do these manual tasks repetitively over and over again, and it really takes that away. So same thing with the security assessment report and the security assessment plan, the SAP and STAR. Same thing. As things are coming up, as it's finding deviations that you're not meeting compliance or controls, it starts to write these things and generate these things for you, and really helps alleviate, like I was saying, all of that manual process and all that manual labor that it takes to start generating these documents and getting them in the right templates. Speaking from experience too, I've worked with customers where maybe the company is helping write your SSP, your STAR, your SAP. The companies you're working with to get to these ATOs. Maybe they're writing them in Google Docs or some other form of a document that you don't use generally in your company. You use Jira or Confluence or some other way to manage your documentation, or maybe you prefer PDFs. And when you download these Google Docs or something and translate them over to PDF or Word or other things like that, sometimes there's a lot of format issues. I've personally experienced that where, some tables are unformatted and things look wonky. They don't meet the FedRAMP template that they gave over because one doc interprets it one way and PDF interprets it another way. So you can really alleviate a lot of that burden and headache too when it comes to like documentation sharing and things like that with using GRC tools. And then evidence collection. It's a big portion of the ATO process. Obviously, you have to say like, hey, we're doing these things, and then you have to collect the evidence to say like, hey, we actually are doing these things. Here's the proof to do it. And you can store a lot of that in the GRC tool of the platform. You can say like, for AC1, this is what we're doing. Here it is. Here's the picture, the screenshot, maybe the code snippet or whatever it is that shows like we're doing this. Here it is right in the tool, centralized. Everybody can log in to see if they need it. The assessor can log in and say the 3PO to see that like, hey, there's the evidence that was provided. You don't have to send them a separate documentation or an email or set them up somewhere in Google Drive. So then the 3PO can get access and go get that kind of information. It's all right there stored in that centralized platform. So it really alleviates a lot of this stuff, and it really takes away from the manual effort and really helps automate compliance to speed up this journey, because it's a long journey and it's a lot of manual effort if you don't use the tools that are out there to help you alleviate a lot of that pain. I'm going to toss over to Cass to talk some.
Awesome. It's getting a lot of warm here. So I prefer standing, so if that's okay. So I think when you go back to the ATO and ADO process documentation, most of these things are not one-time efforts, right? They have to be maintained over a period of time. So it's not just you do it first time you get to your ATO, great, but then you have annual ATO and reauthorization requirements. You have to do reporting. So depending on your term of the ATO, this is a recurring effort. Now, part of this is, I'm going to double click on a couple of points that Mario talked about, which is simple things like collecting all the information from all the different team members and collating all that data into a single nicely formatted document that meets the FISMA FedRAMP template requirement of submission requirements is a very hard thing. I mean, people spend weeks and weeks and weeks on doing that. But then the other aspect is the evidence collection. That part of the evidence collection is things are never going to be constant. So how do you keep up with the new evidence collection aspect of it? So initially if you think of the RMF process, steps 1 through 5, really get to, and there is a slide that's going to come up to this, which is when you get to steps 1 through 5, this is when you're going to be doing a lot of that documentation effort. But when you go through that documentation effort, you have to revisit a lot of these components again and again. Because as the systems are changing, so especially you think about hybrid and multi-cloud deployment. So your deployments could be on Azure, could be AWS, GCP, Oracle, and other things. Things are constantly going to change. Your developers are developing new components of the applications. Things are again changing for these containerized or cloud-native deployments. So when they change, you need to document the change and keep up with the documentation of change. But not only that, you also need to do assessment of what has changed, because system boundary in the first step, the system boundary has changed, right? Because your system components, your assets and asset native components have changed. So you got to keep up track of that. Next, run the assessment. So which is to assess, okay, is this API gateway that I just used, is the container I just used, is the RDS system I just used or I'm using Fargate for deployment of my containerized applications. Change in that environment represents change in the potential risk because of the setups, the configuration that need to be continuously assessed. So part of the elements of documentation that happens here is every one of these change represents something that you need to document, something you need to update, and something you need to monitor, which gets to the step number 6. Because one of the most important things that people tend to forget in getting any of the FedRAMP authorization is part of the RMF step is continuous monitoring. So in these kinds of environments where the scalability becomes a very, very big component, you all know, like in a one click, you can deploy 1,000 containers. Other click, you can shut down 500 containers. I mean, this is constantly changing. EC2 instances, like on AWS, you're going to not actually just deploy one EC2 and try to maintain and manage it. You're going to rehydrate those all throughout the period because you don't want to do patching of the existing golden images. You're going to just bring a new golden image. As these things are changing, you want to know what's changed, what's the impact on security posture, what the impact on the risk posture is. All of that requires continuous monitoring. So part of the GRC element is beyond the documentation, the continuous monitoring, and essentially allowing the authorizing official who is going to authorize this FedRAMP ATO to know how you're managing the risk, right? That becomes a very important component. And that is also not static. Threat vectors are changing. Not just your environment is changing, your threat vectors are changing. So as the threat vectors change, your risk has changed, right? So that part has to be implemented. And then part of that analysis, of course, is mitigation steps. Can you mitigate that based on automation? Can you mitigate based on human processes being kicked off? And then, of course, all of those changes need to be documented as a plan of action and milestone. And within the milestone, you have multiple tasks that you need to finish. All of that documentation, imagine trying to do that in Excel spreadsheets, Google Sheets, or any of those environments. And keeping up that updated documentation so that you never go behind, because trying to catch up on that at the time of the annual review process is not the easiest thing to do, right? So that's where continuous monitoring, continuous updated documentation, continuous management of risk is important. Now, by the way, in some environments, some agencies, there is now a forward-thinking process, right? Which is, in the documentation is important, risk management is even more important. So this continuous monitoring, there's a bigger and bigger emphasis on this. So if you go into a lot of the more recent papers and other that have been written in space, there's a concept called ongoing authorization. There's a concept called continuous ATO, CATO. So all of that requires automation. Because without that, you really never can tell how you're managing your risk and how you're mitigating that risk, right? So all of that, along with the documentation, becomes important. And by the way, the controls may be changing based on initial scope, and the change to the system may require new controls to be implemented, right? And that as a mitigation steps. That means, again, update to your current documentation, which generates new system security plan, security assessment plan, then security assessment reports, and so on, right? So all of these aspects happen. So I just wanted to touch on this ongoing authorization with continuous monitoring. There is a sort of a carrot and stick approach that a lot of agencies are trying to take, is if you can demonstrate that you can truly manage the risk on an ongoing basis for your system, as the system changes, as the threat vectors change, you're updating your risk posture as well, then you can supply a minimal set of documentation for your maintenance aspect, not the initial ATO, that of course that has to be full, but the maintenance of that ATO packages can be minimized, and you can go into this ongoing authorization, which is the part of the annual review is that I'm going to give you ongoing authorization at this point in time. So this is an area that I think is evolving. And you can see this in Rev 2 of the RMF. This particular statement is straight from the RMF, right? And it says, Oregon may choose to eliminate authorization termination date if the continuous monitoring program is sufficiently robust, right? You need to be able to demonstrate that at any point in time to the authorizing official the needed information to conduct the ongoing risk determination and risk acceptance activities with regard to security state of the information system and its ongoing effectiveness of controls employed and inherited by the system. So that applies not only to your components, but your components as they rely on the CSP components, right? Whether it's on AWS or other components of the your GSS, the general support system. So again, to Mario's point, automate, 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 right? A lot of these things really gets down to automation because you just can't manually do this at scale, right? To your system, and the more complex system and more, system, subsystem components where all these sort of try to work together, this starts to become escalating and exponentially harder thing to do. So all of these elements are important in here. As you can see here, Mario mentioned analytics is very important. Because again, when you think about findings, right, security findings or compliance controls findings, they exponentially continue to grow. And so like, okay, well, I go to customers and they say, so Cavs, so you're gonna tell me that I have a lot of problems. I say, yeah, I already have 50,000 problems. You're gonna discover more and make it 75,000 problems? That's a bigger problem I need to deal with now. So I said, yeah, but again, at that point in time, what's important is this Pareto principle, right? This is the 80-20 analysis. Tell me the top 20% that creates an 80% risk in my organization, right? So that's where you first focus on the first 20%. You got to chip away at the problem. There's no magic solution to address all the problems. You got to have chipping away at first 20%, the next 20%, the next 20%, right? That's how you're going to reduce the risk to your system. And that's part of the analysis of analytics. And again, the analytics components start when you start to get into these kinds of scale, needs to be automated. It's not something that humanly you're going to take a whole bunch of findings and then say, I'm going to report against these findings and then analyze these things to figure out which one is most important and so on and so forth. So you have to do a lot of these frequency analysis. There are a lot of different tooling that has to be done. And part of that is, of course, currency of the data, like it has to be current. That means continuously gathering, assessing is very important. But once it's assessed, running that analytics, you need AI component. And when I talk about AI, I usually think about AI as sort of input, processing, and output, right? So the inputs are part of what is coming in. The processing is where you use deep learning, which is called a neural net technology, or machine learning to do frequency analysis, anomaly detection, and things like that. And the output is where you can talk about the, what's currently everybody talks about and thinks about AI is, which is ChatGPT, right? A part of the OpenAI component to actually create the output documentation. But really the focus on the analytics component is about deep learning, is about machine learning, identify where the analysis leads you to the top 20% that you need to focus on, and the top 20% that you need to focus on, right? So those are elements, but also there are things like how I can force the problem to get narrower. So like implementation of zero trust components and other things. But all of that leads ultimately still to your FedRAMP and FedRAMP documentation and updates and plan of actions. Oh, I'm going off screen. I see. Sorry about that. And so I think part of that analysis, when it presents you this information, gives you a path to resolution, right? That top 20%. All right. And by the way, if all of that generates into documentation, update to the controls, and automation of some of that documentation evidence collection, that also helps you to maintain that ATO package. And so with that, we wanted to leave enough time for questions and make it interactive. Did you guys find this helpful? That's good. Good nodding of heads here.
What is your position on how OSCL will change kind of not only the compliance artifact generation, but also, you know, your 3POW process and your continuous compliance aspects as well?
So I can go first.
Yeah.
There's also a session I think later today at 3 that really digs into OSCL a little bit more and goes a lot more deeper into it. But I think it could be very helpful. As we talked about, a lot of automate this. It alleviates a lot of pain points. Again, kind of not as much, but machine readable documentation is kind of what it's pointing to. So kind of a little bit more how I talked about earlier, to kind of a little bit of the perspective of, you know, you have PDF docs, documentation, you're trying to get all of these sources into one place, or to translate that to somewhere else or to another system or to another source. OSCL can help get that all into one format, one thing. So I know like FedRAMP accepted their first OSCL SSP, was it like 2 years ago or something like that, or in 2018, 2019, so maybe a little bit longer, but somewhere around there. I believe it can be very helpful in the future to get those things iterated and to get a common source template for things to be accepted. So, you know, you're not accepting a bunch of SSPs in different languages, like format, documentation, things like that. And then to make that automation point a lot easier for machines or systems or GRC tools, GRC platforms to bring that information in and digest it and then keep iterating and doing the continuous monitoring of that portion of keeping, you know, your SSP, your SAR, your POEMs, your tasks, all those things up to date in a convenient manner.
Yeah, and other thing is it's not just about output in OSCL, right? It's also the input. Like you can make the changes to the control and, you know, how you're going to be effectively implementing it. And then the results of that assessment based on that control and new changes. For example, let's say there are agency specified or, you know, your organization specified frequency or the size of the, you know, let's say the password length, you know, duration of change should be, instead of 90 days now become 60 days, right? You can make that change very quickly and very pointedly based on this OSCL update. Like, okay, my control now has 60 days versus 90 days, and your evaluation automatically should change from every 90 day, you know, when you look at the system and the password change policy is now changed from 90 day to 60 day. If it's not meeting certain requirements for a particular component of the application, you can fail it or pass it, right? Depending on that. And then reporting again the update to based on your findings, saying, yeah, it's now changed to 60 days. Through OSCL as a machine readable component can be updated. So it's not a complete change and update to the entire documentation, right? It's the pointed change. So it's not only the input part, but also the output part. I think OSCL becomes a very powerful method to do that. Does that help? Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions or anything? Cool. So I think we're wrapped up a little bit earlier, but yeah, I just really want to hammer home the power of GRC tools, the power of a GRC platform to really help, and like we can't say it enough, to automate these things. You know, maybe you cobble together some AWS services to at least alleviate some of the pain, you know, using AWS config or security hub, guard duty, things like that, to really hammer away at the automation piece to alleviate these tasks from folks that, you know, are tracking things in Excel or Google Docs and whatever it may be. That's a lot of manual effort, and as Kyle was saying, it keeps going. You know, your assessment isn't one-time thing. You have to keep updating these documentations. You have to keep updating your POEMs. Risks change, compliance change, controls change. So, you know, there's always going to be something that's changing. And then, you know, if you're having the manual update of doing that, you know, now that's somebody's job to keep on top of these controls as they change, you know, keep on top of the compliance within your own system, tracking the compliance in your system, making POEM tasks out of it, assigning those tasks to folks, making sure the workflow is getting done, collecting the evidence from that task that now somebody's updated, and then you have to go update your SSP, the SAR, all of that good stuff. And GRC tools really help alleviate all of that. You know, they'll find a compliance deviation, they'll let you know, you can send alerts, have people work on it, create the POEM and all that stuff right in the one platform, and then it can pull it all into your documentation and really help alleviate a lot of that manual effort.
And just to add to that, you know, when you think about, let's say you build this initial document, your SSP is 400 pages long, and your SAR document with the Excel and Word document, let's say, is another 200, at least 250 page long. Okay, that's your initial baseline. Now, if you want to change that baseline on your annual review process, you know, or a quarterly review process, but certainly annual review process that you need to submit. Now, imagine all of this to be done on a manual basis requires regeneration of this new 400-page document. Well, what if you're using the proper GRC tools and platforms, you know that most of the times the changes are not that dramatic. I mean, there may be, let's say, 5%, 10%, 15% change to your system, and it's how it operates and changes that need to be done. So now if you could have ability, since all this is in a single platform, all this information is there, you know the impacted controls are about 5% or 10% controls, you make the changes on, in the system for that 5 or 10% impacted changes, it spits out a new SSP, right? You take the existing package, you make a clone of it, it has all the content you wrote for that 400 page. Now there are these 20 pages that you need to change based on this set of controls that impacted. It made your job so much easier, right? Maintaining and updating it. So that I think is a huge benefit for having this centralization. Second thing I would say is collaboration. Because again, if you collaborate based on emails and Excels and Slacks and Google Sheets and all that, well, that's one way to do it, or SharePoints for that. Somebody who's a Microsoft, I don't want to say if you're not, you're the SharePoint is the same concept. But then collaboration where you can actually say, hey, take a look at what I've just written, review it and approve it by control basis or assessment by assessment basis. All of that is within the platform itself. They get notified, they go in, check that component, and that update is complete now, right? Instead of somebody updating and collecting it and pushing it into your documentation is all done for you. So automation is of the continuous monitoring. Also, there's a huge component we talked about, but even the documentation, collaboration, creation, updates become so much more pinpointed and incremental in the follow-on years that a lot of the load is reduced in submitting those and updating those documents.
Probably need some sort of machine learning model triggering based on you're a newer CSP, you don't have they can learn. I'm wondering what some initial use cases for 3 to 4-year-old companies.
Yeah, so actually, I would say that the first day you start building the knowledge of your environment as a CSP, right? Using this automation, starts building your baseline. And the baseline, you don't have to wait for a year. I mean, your baseline is, I can pretty guarantee you that every day, every week is changed. Some things are changing in that particular environment. You may be adding new services, you may be changing the components of the environment, whatever may be the case, right? So it's constantly learning from all of that. Every learning adds to the previous learning aspects of it. So learning is continuous in that nature. So the machine learning algorithms are continuously taking the new updates, adding it to the previous baseline that they currently had. And so this process is ongoing from day one, so like day 2 onwards, think of it that way. In any part of the machine learning, you ultimately have to train the model, right? To train the model to say, if it's supervisory inputs you needed, then you can say, yeah, this is right, this is wrong, or yep, this is not up to date. But there are other machine learning algorithms which are self-learning algorithms as well. They're non-supervisory inputs required. So they are, as long as they're bound in the context of the model, the training model, then it will keep learning on its own continuously. So I don't think you would have to wait for too long. I mean, if you're a 3-4-year-old company, the day you started, I would say within a week, you're starting to have enough of data to start to feed the machine learning algorithms. And then by end of the month, you probably have a really good data set that's already there and just keeps evolving from that point onwards. Now, if you truly want to move away from supervisory inputs, you need to really look at deep learning, right? The neural net technology, which is another kind of AI component. The the benefit of neural net technology, also known as deep learning technology, is it does not require supervisory inputs, right? So machine learning requires supervisory inputs, neural net doesn't. Again, you don't have to worry about it because the program already is built in these platforms, and it can build it for you. But the neural net allows, it basically triangulates. Think of it as it has 3 different algorithms it will use to come to a conclusion. If they are all matching very closely, it says, yeah, this is good. They have something called long-term, short-term memories on that, and it builds itself on its own. Again, you don't have to worry about how it does it, but the distinction, I think, is important, that it doesn't require supervisor inputs. Machine learning does require supervisor inputs. So to answer your question, I think the day 2, I think we should start to get a benefit of that, any of these components of AI, right? Because all of that ultimately feeds into the analytics, which, I mean, the end state of all of this is, give me the top 20% I should focus on that I can reduce my risk posture, right?
Question, would you advise kind of going back and feeding those, let's say, outer history of time, you go back and convert those?
Not necessarily. I mean, I would think that your last document, right, is your document that you have presented to the authorizing official. If that can be converted into OSCAL, right? And again, there are many different ways, like, a lot of the tooling will allow you to export it as an Excel and import it back in as an Excel, right? Components. And once that is done, converting output to an OSCAL is already pre-built in the tooling. So you can generate that. So I would say just the last is the most important one, because the other one is more historical data, and is relevant, but not that relevant, because your current state is what matters.
Yeah, to point to that of the current documentation. So, as you make your documentation, that's the new baseline. Something comes out, you change compliance needs, you change security controls, stuff like that to meet the risk. That's now new baseline. So like he was saying, just converting your newest documentation would probably be the starting point. But then if you wanted to, like if you're using AI or some kind of learning module, it wouldn't be hurtful to go back and then now change all of those old documentation to OSCAL. So if you're trying to train your model and have it learn more. But yeah, like you were saying, the newest documentation is always going to be your new baseline. As things change, as you make an update, you have a new baseline. Something comes out, new controls change, new risk is introduced into your system, you have to remediate it. Now you have a new baseline you have to go update to. So that newest living document should always be your new baseline.
Your starting point, yeah.
Your starting point, yeah.
So, you mentioned about common control. Then the cloud enterprises, they may have their own sort of hosting provider like AWS, they have their own common. And then they have different expiration date or validation of that control. And those things are included in the package that I'm creating for my application. How does that kind of reconcile expiration date or so speak? How does it package it in the format of application or creating?
Yeah. You want me to take it?
Good.
Sure. So I think, so there are, if you broaden that question, control, let's say there are 100 controls. Of the 100 controls, let's say 30% of the controls are inherited from the cloud service provider, right? Or infrastructure service provider. And maybe there are another 30% that are enterprise common controls. So they are essentially how enterprise implements certain things, from identity access management, security authorization boundary, and things like that. So that gets you another 30%. And let's say now the 40% are system specific, or it's a combination of system specific and hybrid, right? Because there are part system specific implementation, and there's part what you have as common control inherited from CSP or enterprise. So it's a question of all of that coming together. Now, things in between some of those controls could be expired for the reasons of frequency of testing, right? Some might say, hey, this part, whether the encryption is on all your S3 buckets, as an example, should be a part of a control for encryption testing. And once in a year is not good enough for tests. You need to revalidate that literally every month, kind of scenario. And hence it expires every 30 days. But the control documentation of how it is done doesn't change. How frequently it's tested changes. So really the ability for you to take your controls as a Lego building blocks, right? What you inherit from CSP, what you inherit from enterprise, and what are system specific, still stays the same. Is the frequency of the testing of those controls, which is the component of assessment, right? Part of the after implementation, your assessment step is now changing, and the expiration is a mechanism that everybody uses to force, added tests, which will update your SAR, which will update your SAP and things like that.